Welcome to Marla Responds, where you get answers to your questions about the Caribbean so you can anticipate risk and make informed decisions. Marla, let's get right into today's questions. Starting off with tourism impacts from COVID-19, what do you anticipate the impacts will be, particularly on small businesses?
Well, it depends on the degree of dependence that this small business has on the tourism sector. And of course, the impact will be more negative the more dependent the small business is on the tourism sector, either directly or indirectly. Now, it's important to remember that there's a multiplier effect, both positive and negative. But in this case, in a negative way, when hotels are shut, restaurants are shut, people are sent home, cruise ship passengers aren't arriving, the consumption of all of these people will decline and will change as well and will shift. And so the small businesses that depend on the expenditure and the consumption of basically the population, the workforce that depends on tourism, they will be severely affected. And many small businesses are not really prepared to take this kind of hit. And so I expect that there's actually going to be a decline in the size of the private sector and the size of the whole economy. I mean, the whole economy in every country in this region is going to decline this year, except maybe for Guyana. And so I expect the size of the private sector as well will be affected.
And what can tourism-dependent countries be doing right now to help them bounce back after the crisis?
Yeah, that's $1 million question. The thing about it is I've noticed that some countries like Barbados, for example, Anguilla, I'm hearing a bit about this, and other small countries that haven't closed their borders, but have a thriving high-end villa luxury market. Those countries have been doing better simply because people can fly in on their private jets and don't have to depend on commercial aircraft and cruise ships, and they can come up on their own private vessels as well. And so perhaps the countries that have some element of this sector, the luxury high-end segment of the market, perhaps they can look at how can they make this sector safe, and so that they can reopen as soon as possible. And what does safe mean? In the first place, we need to be able to identify people who are the least vulnerable in your workforce, so that we can get these people, not just in tourism, but in any sector. These are the people who are most likely to be able to go back to work. Even, for example, bus drivers. You would not want to put your bus drivers out there who are diabetic, who are hypertensive, etc. You would want to choose the ones who are most likely to survive and to be able to not succumb to this COVID-19 disease. And so we need to think about, in a recovery, how do we identify a workforce, not just in tourism, in any sector, that is safe. So you have to screen the workforce. So that's the first thing. And then any activity that we do, whether it's the airport, whether it's in the tourism sector in terms of providing accommodation, providing meals, how do we re-engineer these processes to make them safer and to make sure that there's social distancing, to make sure that proper protocols are followed with respect to hygiene and so on. And so that's how I feel we should approach this in the market that is on the higher end, more luxury, so smaller amounts of people, and easier to manage with respect to COVID-19, social distancing protocols, etc., and safe practices.
And what other service industries can the Caribbean develop to reduce their dependence on tourism in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've been saying for a while that I feel like the Caribbean is the perfect place to benefit from the gig economy. And I think that COVID-19 has demonstrated to us just how important it is to really look at that as a solution for our economic growth and for jobs and employment in a sustainable manner. What do I mean by that? Historically, we've had a challenge in the region where we've lost our best talent to the developed countries with this brain drain phenomenon that we've had to deal with for decades. And I mean, the one benefit of that is that people send remittances back home, but by no means does it compensate for the loss that we've suffered in losing all of this talent. But what if our talent here doesn't have to leave to get a job abroad? What if our lawyers, our psychologists, our physical trainers, teachers, what if they can access jobs overseas online, and they can earn income that's in foreign currency, hard currency, that they then get, they bring home? Now, the thing about really capitalizing on that kind of economic model is that you need to have really good connectivity. So telecoms infrastructure has to be really good, and you have to have a low crime rate and a safe environment. So people feel safe to stay here and they don't feel compelled to leave, and they have to be able to get proper housing and infrastructure and all of these things. So I think that we need to probably think about how do we position ourselves to allow for our people and our talent, instead of feeling forced to leave, how do we then give them the access that they need, and how do we compel our people to seek employment online in the gig economy? And I think that's the way forward in not just any particular sector, but throughout all sectors in a cross-cutting way.
Okay, and even more specifically, if travel restrictions and social distancing are continued for an extended period, where can the displaced workers be redeployed?
So there are some countries that are thinking about how do we retrain people to become self-employed. Now that's a really difficult equation to solve for, because presumably people working in the tourism sector, you know, if they wanted to become, for example, a farmer, a hairdresser, a barber, a coder, it's going to require investment in their education, and that costs money. A lot of governments are really strapped right now, but perhaps if the governments decide to give support to individuals. I know, for example, in Trinidad, they're distributing seeds. In Barbados, they're giving out land to people who want to farm. I feel like whatever you can avail of that the government is giving to support people, I would encourage citizens who are affected by this crisis, especially in the tourism sector, to try something new. Avail yourself of whatever the government is offering, whatever even the NGOs and the charitable organizations are offering to help retool and possibly, open an avenue into a new job, a new career.
Why do you believe it's important for governments to seek external support from multilaterals like the IMF right now? And what types of financing, or what types of restrictions do you believe that this financing would bring on us?
Well, the IMF has an emergency rapid, I forget the exact name of it, but it's for rapid disbursement and in emergency situations like what we have now, that does not come with any conditions. And the reason why I think we need to explore these options is because most countries, if not all countries right now in this region, are not earning foreign exchange via exports of commodities as much as they used to, or via the tourism sector as much as they used to, or at all. And it's only a matter of time before your foreign exchange reserves start to dwindle. And so why wait until you're in a liquidity crisis and in a balance of payments crisis, to then seek support from the multilateral lending agencies. I think we should be seeking that support now frontally and hold on to it so that when you need it, it's there.
Do you see COVID-19 as potentially reversing the level of globalization and causing a major long-term shift in global trade?
I do. And I do see many countries starting to look more inwardly in terms of what can they provide for themselves as opposed to importing as much as they used to and financed by exports in a few things that they have a competitive advantage. And I think many more countries, certainly in this region, are looking to see how they can provide for themselves. And so that implies that the whole global trade, which was already declining last year, in particular, global trade is going to continue to decline as many more countries try to produce, in a sense, an import substituting type approach. But also people's consumption patterns are going to change just because there isn't the availability of all of the goods that we're used to in some cases. So that means I think that there is definitely going to be some change in terms of the way we operate with respect to trade internationally and globally.
Okay, and what's the role of Caribbean integration in minimizing the impact in the region?
Well, first of all, that word integration is a very sensitive and loaded word sometimes in the region. I think that regional cooperation is so much more important now than it has ever been. And back in the days of the West Indies Federation, this regional approach to solving all our problems is what it was all about. In terms of some countries being the breadbaskets, some countries providing energy, and other countries, each country providing something and contributing something to the whole, as opposed to each country trying to go it on its own and being more dependent on food and energy supplies that come from outside the region as opposed to those that come from within the region. Now, CARICOM is supposed to address that, but I don't think that we have by any stretch achieved or we haven't really seen the full benefit of regionalism in this region. I think there's so much more that can be done, and I do believe, CARICOM has already had exceptional meetings these past couple of months to help to address this situation. And I do believe that that kind of regional approach, even in terms of asking for debt forgiveness from the multilaterals, I think that regional approach is gaining some momentum. I would like to see it continue, and I would like to see a really longer term, coming out of this, a longer term approach to solving our energy independence, food independence, for example, on a regional scale.
How much of our economic woes in the Caribbean are due to a governance crisis, a lack of transparency, a lack of fiscal discipline, a lack of accountability, and what can be done now to shift this?
Yes, that's actually, okay, so that lack of, or I should say weakness in terms of governance and accountability and transparency stem from institutional weakness. The IDB had done a brilliant book a couple of years, I think it might have been 2018, that discussed this challenge in a lot of detail and based on a lot of empirical work. And a lot of what they looked at in this book can be explained by historical factors. Were we an extractive colony or were we a settler colony? And you would find that the extractive colonies have much weaker institutions than the settler colonies. Fast forward 50 plus years, many of us are still affected by these institutional post-traumatic stress disorders, if you will, that existed so long ago, half a century ago. And we really haven't focused on building institutional strength in this region. And so that is a big part of why we've not had the kind of socioeconomic progress that we ought to have had. And that's a big part of our challenges that exist today, but even before COVID-19. And one of the shining examples I would like to highlight of how a meaningful reform agenda can make all the difference, and that's Jamaica. Jamaica, during their IMF program that started around, I think, 2012 and then ended just last year, in the first place, having a fiscal responsibility framework has made a big difference. Having their statistical infrastructure improved has made a big difference. Even the fact that they have an economic policy oversight committee that is responsible for determining what economic policies are going to be implemented and being accountable for that implementation and reporting on a quarterly basis to the population, that I think has made a huge difference. And that in itself is an institution. And I think every country in this region needs an institution like the EPOC and also the Economic Growth Council that they have in Jamaica, and then the Fiscal Council as well. I think these kinds of institutional structures that did not exist or doesn't exist anywhere else really in the region except in Jamaica now, I feel are so important, has made all the difference in Jamaica, and that those institutions have really driven accountability, transparency, governance, and has driven the kind of socioeconomic progress that Jamaica is seeing now. I mean, before COVID-19, Jamaica had the lowest poverty rate that they've ever had, and the lowest unemployment rate that they've ever had. And that's not by luck and chance. Sorry.
And what types of measures can be taken now to protect the most vulnerable and those who've been out of work now for several weeks without income?
You know, I think the most important thing that every country needs to look at is to feed people. And if we think about that same framework I spoke about, where we identify people who are safe, who are less vulnerable, and we identify the activities that we need to conduct, and we make those activities safer, I feel like there is a huge opportunity for us to take labor that is now idle and, well, once they're deemed safe, and get them to help work on a food program that feeds people, because a lot of people have been out of work and really don't have the means to feed their families. And there's so many NGOs, the churches and so on, that are really good at executing on a very grassroots level, but also they know in their community who are the most vulnerable. And so I feel like we need in every country a strategy that looks at utilizing all of these stakeholders I just mentioned to help to feed people in the short term. That to me is the most important thing.
What are the risks to foreign exchange and to local equity markets in this environment?
Local equity markets, insofar as there is any activity, I can't imagine that there would be any price increases. I would imagine that the markets will be trending downward once. I'm not sure that there's trading taking place right now. But with respect to foreign exchange, obviously on a global basis, we are seeing a flight to quality, and this region is no exception. So I'm not terribly afraid of that kind of a situation exploding. But what I think is going to become more and more urgent is when foreign exchange starts running out because we haven't earned as much from exports and from tourism, for example, that it's going to be much tighter in terms of the FX liquidity. I quite believe that there are a few countries in this region that will run into a balance of payments crisis and will have to go to the IMF and ask for an IMF program. Just before COVID-19 hit, I was, my outlook was that, Suriname and Trinidad would be the next to fall and go to the IMF program.
Okay, well,
But
mhm.
I think there will be others,
Okay.
as well. Mhm.
Let's shift the focus to Trinidad and Tobago specifically because I've gotten a lot of questions specific to that economy. What economic risks should the economic recovery team announced by the Prime Minister focus on first, and what should be done to exit crisis?
Right. So what should be done first? As I discussed, it's really about identifying a workforce. So each employer, both in the public sector and private sector, needs to look at who their workforce is and identifying who is safe and can most readily be deployed when the time is right. And that kind of screening, I think, is a very important thing to take place as soon as possible. Then we have to look at the activities that are most critical. So apart from the frontline medical staff, like I said, like feeding people, even teachers getting kids to a point where they're learning online, or even in a very in months down the road in schools, we have to re-engineer our processes to make them safe. And that's where I think we need to start from now in terms of thinking and re-engineering these processes so that we can, start to reopen and reestablish some level of economic activity once it's safe as well, because we've not seen too many new cases or haven't seen new cases for weeks. But then when you look at what's happening in Singapore and in South Korea with second waves and third waves, because so many people are asymptomatic and they are spreading it, that makes it very tricky. But again, if we've made the processes and the activities safe, then there is less likely that opening back up is going to mean a second or third wave.
What other alternatives for the fiscal and monetary policy response in Trinidad and Tobago could be employed?
Alternatives to what was already announced in terms of fiscal policy, monetary policy. I think that really so in terms of monetary policy, we've had the central bank basically reduce the reserve requirement and basically give more liquidity to the banks to lend. I think what is also required is a regulatory relaxing of restrictions and on banks basically, so that concentration limits and requirements around provisioning for non-performing loans, these kinds of things, I think we need to relax those because it's going to be, portfolios and credit quality is really going to suffer. It's suffering already. And so that's another thing I think on the monetary side, the regulators need to do. Now, on the fiscal side in Trinidad and Tobago, it's actually not very clear to me to what extent is there going to be fiscal stimulus. And let me explain what I mean by that. The government has taken money from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. They've gotten money from the development banks. But I am not sure the extent to which this money, this new liquidity, is over and above what the government was expecting to earn in revenue anyway. Or is there still a shortfall based on the revenue that they're actually going to collect plus what they borrowed? Is there still a shortfall based on what they were going to spend prior to COVID-19? And so I am not actually convinced that there's going to be fiscal stimulus or extra fiscal spending versus what the government had originally planned to spend. So for example, you heard the Minister of Finance say to the business community, you need to pay your taxes. That in itself suggests to me that that's not stimulus. And spending on unemployment relief and so on is something we need a lot more of. But is that spending over and above what we were planning to spend on other forms of social spending and also wages and salaries? So I am not too sure that there's actual fiscal stimulus happening in Trinidad because the numbers, again, have not been shared in a clear and transparent manner.
The sharp contraction you expect for GDP in Trinidad and Tobago, which you've said in other videos could reach 15% this year, what does that mean in terms of our everyday livelihood?
Well, if you think of an economy that has contracted by 15%, bring that into your own personal financial terms. Think of your salary contracting by 15%. Think of your wealth contracting by 15%, your income and your wealth. And that's what it means really on average on an individual level. Think of your revenue. If you have a business, think of your revenue contracting by at least 15%. And that's when you get to realize what the impact, it means that everybody is going to be affected in terms of their income, their wealth, and their spending power. Some more than others, but the average is probably going to be around 15%. And so you will likely see many businesses close down. You will likely see many people becoming, well, already, I think unemployment might be around 30 to 40% right now, simply because we've had a sudden stop. But when things restart, we might still be looking at unemployment that is, in the double digits, certainly. And so when you have high unemployment, it means that it puts downward pressure on wages. And so wages are not likely to increase. When you get a new job, if you are able to secure a job, the wage that you would likely be able to attract is probably going to be less than what you had before.
Okay. With that, Marla, we'll go ahead and wrap up. You can continue to submit your questions for the next time through the form that we have up at bit.ly/2020 Ask Marla. And we'd like to thank everyone that took the time to submit their questions. Stay healthy and safe.
Thank you. Take care.